I watched my wife stand in front of the restaurant she built with her own hands, pulling on a door that wouldn't open. The lock had been changed. Catherine looked back at me with confusion in her eyes, the kind that breaks you from the inside. She asked me if she forgot her keys again. I knew she hadn't forgotten anything. Someone had decided she no longer belonged in the place where she'd spent 43 years of her life. Diane stood inside, visible through the glass door. She saw us. She looked directly at Catherine, then turned her back and walked toward the kitchen. That moment told me everything I needed to know about what came next. Before I tell you how this ends, I want you to understand something. I spent 30 years as a forensic accountant. I built my career finding money that people tried to hide. When I retired 5 years ago, I thought I was done looking for lies in spreadsheets. I was wrong. Sometimes the most important audit of your life happens in your own family. The restaurant sits on a corner in Brooklyn, red brick, green awning, the kind of place that feels like it's always been there. Catherine opened it in 1981 with money borrowed from her father and a recipe book her grandmother brought from Naples. The neighborhood changed around it a dozen times, but Catherine's remained. People came for the food, yes, but they stayed for what the food represented. Continuity, tradition, a place where things were made the right way, every single time. Catherine was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 2 years ago. The doctors said it would progress slowly, that she had time, that we should make plans. We did make plans. We decided Catherine would stay involved as long as she could, that the restaurant would remain her purpose, her anchor. We told our daughter, Rebecca, everything. She promised she understood. She promised she'd help us protect what her mother built. 6 months later, she introduced us to Diane. She was charming in the way that makes you feel guilty for being suspicious. She asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, complimented the food with specific details that made Catherine light up. She said she worked in hospitality consulting, that she'd always dreamed of being part of a real family business. Rebecca looked at her like she'd hung the moon. We wanted to be happy for her. We tried. They married quickly, which Rebecca said was because they were sure, because when you know, you know. Diane offered to help with the restaurant, said she could handle the business side while Catherine focused on the kitchen. It seemed reasonable. Catherine was forgetting appointments, losing track of orders. I was stretched thin trying to manage both the books and her care. Diane presented herself as the solution we needed.
The changes started small. New vendors, which Diane said offered better prices. Updated scheduling software, which she said would streamline operations. A redesigned menu layout, which she claimed would increase orders. Catherine noticed, but every time she questioned something, Diane had an answer ready, always delivered with a smile, always framed as helping Catherine, protecting Catherine, honoring Catherine's legacy while bringing it into the modern era. I should have paid closer attention. I tell myself that now, in the quiet moments when the guilt creeps in. But I was watching Catherine, not the business. I was counting her medications, attending her doctor's appointments, making sure she ate breakfast, reminding her where she put her reading glasses. I missed what was happening 6 feet away from me because I was so focused on keeping my wife safe from her own failing memory. The first real warning came from Marie, our head waitress. She'd been with us for 22 years, since she was a teenager saving for college. She came to the apartment above the restaurant one evening, the one we'd lived in since the beginning, where you could smell the marinara sauce through the floorboards and hear the kitchen rhythm like a heartbeat. She sat at our table, hands folded, and said Diane had let go of 3 longtime staff members that week. She said she'd told them the restaurant was restructuring, that their positions were redundant. She said she'd hired her own people, younger, cheaper, none of them with any connection to the place. Catherine was confused. She said she hadn't agreed to fire anyone. Marie looked at me, and I saw the question in her eyes. Did Catherine forget, or was something else happening? I promised her I'd look into it. She nodded, but I could see she was scared, wondering if her job was next, if the place she'd grown up in was disappearing. That night, after Catherine went to sleep, I did what I should have done months earlier. I opened the restaurant's financial records. Diane had taken over the bookkeeping, said it was one less thing for me to worry about, said she had systems in place, modern accounting software that would make everything easier. I'd let her, grateful for one less responsibility. The numbers didn't make sense. Revenue was steady, but profit margins had collapsed. Vendor costs had increased dramatically despite Diane's promises of better deals. There were consulting fees paid to a company I didn't recognize, loan payments to a lender I'd never approved. I stayed up until 4 in the morning tracing transactions, following trails that looped back on themselves. By sunrise, I understood. Diane had created a shell company. Fictitious consulting fees were being paid to an entity she controlled. She'd taken out a business loan in Catherine's name, forged her signature on documents I'd never seen. The money hadn't gone into the restaurant. It had vanished into accounts I couldn't access. And the loan, secured against the building itself, was already in default. I sat at that table as light filled the kitchen, looking at printouts covered in my own handwriting, proof of systematic theft. My daughter's wife was stealing my wife's life's work, and she was doing it with enough sophistication to suggest she'd done this before. I didn't confront her that morning. I'd spent 30 decades learning that when you discover fraud, you don't alert the person committing it until you have everything you need. Instead, I smiled when Diane came up for coffee. I asked her how things were going downstairs. She said they were great, better than ever, that Catherine should be proud. Catherine smiled, trusting, grateful that someone was taking care of her restaurant.
Over the next 2 weeks, I became two people. During the day, I was the concerned husband, the helpful father-in-law, the man gracefully accepting his wife's decline. At night, I was what I used to be. I pulled bank records, traced corporate filings, documented every transaction. I contacted old colleagues, people who knew how to find things others wanted hidden. I discovered Diane had done this twice before. Married into family businesses, extracted value, disappeared before anyone could act. Rebecca didn't know. I'm sure of that now, though I wasn't then. She thought Diane was saving the restaurant, that her changes were necessary, that her mother's confusion was making her resistant to progress. She'd stopped asking Catherine's opinion on decisions, started directing questions to Diane instead. She was protecting her wife, the same way I was protecting mine. We'd just chosen different people to believe. The confrontation I'd been preparing for came faster than I expected. I arrived at the restaurant one Tuesday morning to find Catherine standing outside, trying her key in a lock that no longer recognized it. Diane had changed it overnight. When I knocked, Diane took her time answering. She said the locks were changed for security, that there had been a break-in scare, that she'd meant to give us new keys but forgot. Catherine accepted the explanation. I didn't. Inside, the restaurant looked different. Catherine's name, which had been painted on the back wall in elegant script since 1981, was gone, covered with a fresh coat of paint, replaced with new lettering that said, Caterina's Modern Italian. Catherine stood very still, staring at the wall. She asked why her name was gone. Diane put a hand on her shoulder and said the old sign was dated, that modern branding was essential, that this was all part of the plan we'd discussed. Catherine looked at me, uncertain, asking with her eyes if she'd forgotten again. That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Diane was accelerating her timeline, growing bold enough to erase Catherine in plain sight. If I didn't act now, there would be nothing left to save. That evening, Diane called a family meeting. She said it was time to discuss Catherine's future, that we all needed to face reality. She'd arranged for Rebecca to be there, and she'd invited a representative from a senior living facility, a woman with a warm smile and a folder full of brochures. She talked about memory care, about specialized environments, about how much happier Catherine would be in a place designed for her needs. Catherine sat quietly, listening to strangers discuss where she should live, whether she could still be trusted in her own kitchen. Diane talked about the burden of care, about how much I was struggling, about how the restaurant needed full-time management that Catherine could no longer provide. She said it with sympathy, with concern, like she was doing us a favor. Then she brought out the documents, a care facility contract already filled out, a power of attorney transfer giving Diane full control of business operations, a sale agreement for the building with an interested buyer already lined up. She slid them across the table and said we could make this easy or hard, but either way, it was time. Rebecca looked uncomfortable but didn't speak. The care facility woman smiled encouragingly. Diane waited, pen ready. I said, no. Just that word, clear and final. Diane frowned. She started to explain again, slowly, like I hadn't understood. I interrupted her. I said I understood perfectly, that I'd had 2 weeks to understand exactly what was happening, and the answer was no. I watched her face change, the warmth draining out of it. She said I was being emotional, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that this was hard for everyone, but necessary. I opened my briefcase and took out a folder, much thicker than hers. I placed it on the table between us. I told her I knew about Riverside Consulting, LLC, the shell company she'd created 3 weeks after marrying Rebecca. I knew about the $18,000 a month in fictitious consulting fees. I knew about the loan she'd taken in Catherine's name, the forged signature I'd had authenticated by a handwriting expert. I knew the buyer interested in our building was another company she controlled. I knew this because finding hidden money was what I did for 30 years, and I was very, very good at it. The room went completely silent. Rebecca stared at Diane, then at me, then back at Diane. The care facility woman quietly began gathering her materials. Diane's face had gone blank, calculating. She tried recovery. She said there were misunderstandings, that business structures were complex, that I was confused about standard operating procedures. I let her talk. Then I told her I'd already filed a police report for fraud and identity theft. I told her I'd contacted the bank that issued the loan and provided evidence of forgery. I told her I'd alerted the state liquor authority about her unlicensed management of a licensed premises. I told her I'd documented every single transaction and provided copies to the district attorney's office. I hadn't done all of those things yet, but she didn't know that. Diane stood up. She said I was making a terrible mistake, that I was destroying my daughter's marriage, that I'd regret this. I stayed seated. I said the only thing I regretted was not protecting my wife sooner. I said she had 24 hours to return every dollar she'd taken, to sign over any interest she claimed in the business, and to leave. After that, everything I'd told her I'd done would actually be done. Rebecca started crying. She looked at Diane, waiting for her to deny it, to explain it away. She didn't. She looked at me with something like respect, the way one professional acknowledges another when the game is over. Then she walked out. Rebecca stayed. She asked if it was true. I showed her the documents, every one. She read them slowly, her hands shaking. When she finished, she didn't defend her. She asked how long I'd known. I told her 2 weeks. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner. I said I needed to be sure, that I needed evidence that couldn't be argued away, and that I wasn't certain she'd believe me over her. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she asked what happened now. I said that was up to her. She was an adult, married to a woman who'd committed fraud against her family. She could choose to stay with her, but if she did, she couldn't be part of the restaurant. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I couldn't trust her judgment when it came to Diane. Catherine had been quiet through all of this, trying to follow, losing pieces, picking them up again. She asked Rebecca if she was okay. Even then, confused and betrayed, her instinct was to protect our daughter. Rebecca broke down completely. apologizing over and over. She said she didn't know, that Diane told her she was helping, that she thought she was supporting the family. I believed her. I didn't forgive her yet, but I believed her. Diane didn't return the money. I didn't expect her to. I filed everything I'd threatened to file, and I added more. I contacted 2 of her previous victims, women whose families she'd targeted the same way. They agreed to give statements. The case built itself, piece by piece, until even Diane's lawyer told her to negotiate. The settlement took 3 months. Diane signed over any claim to the restaurant, agreed to a repayment plan she'd probably never fulfill, and accepted a restraining order. Rebecca filed for divorce. She moved back into the apartment above the restaurant, into her childhood bedroom, and started working in the kitchen. Not managing, not making decisions, just working, washing dishes, prepping vegetables, learning her mother's recipes before they disappeared with her memory. Catherine's condition progressed, as the doctor said it would. There are days now when she doesn't recognize the restaurant, when the kitchen she built feels foreign to her. But there are still good days, days when her hands remember what her mind doesn't, when she can teach a young cook how to properly sauce pasta, when she tastes something and smiles because it's exactly right. I hired a new manager, someone with no family connection, no agenda beyond running a good restaurant. Marie stayed, and so did most of the original staff. We removed Diane's modern branding and restored Catherine's name to the wall, exactly where it had always been. The restaurant breathes the way it used to, steady and sure. Rebecca and I are rebuilding trust, slowly. She helps with Catherine's care now, takes shifts sitting with her when confusion hits, reads her recipes like bedtime stories. She asks me about the accounting sometimes, wants to learn how to protect the business properly. I teach her, knowing that someday she'll need to do this without me. People ask if I'm angry at her. I'm not anymore. She made the mistake of trusting someone she loved. I understand that mistake. I made it too, in smaller ways, every time I wanted to believe Diane's explanations instead of following my instincts. What I protected wasn't really a restaurant. It was Catherine's dignity, her right to be remembered in the place she created, her name on a wall that outlasts memory. I protected the proof that her life meant something, that she built something real, something that couldn't be erased by locks and fresh paint and convenient forgeries. 6 months after Diane left, we had a small celebration at the restaurant, just family and staff, people who'd been there from the beginning. Catherine was having a good day. She stood at the stove and made her grandmother's bolognese, the recipe that started everything, hands moving through steps she'd performed 10,000 times. The kitchen smelled right again, like garlic and thyme and continuity. Rebecca stood beside her, learning, writing nothing down because that's not how these recipes survive. They survive in muscle memory, in the weight of salt in your palm, in knowing by smell when something is done. She was learning what I'd learned years ago, that some things are worth protecting, even when protection is hard, even when it costs you peace, even when it makes you the difficult one. That night, after everyone left, Catherine and I sat in the apartment upstairs. She asked me if the restaurant would be okay. I told her yes, it would be okay, that Rebecca was learning, that the recipes were safe. She nodded, satisfied, and said she was tired. I helped her to bed, and she fell asleep almost immediately, at peace in a way she hadn't been in months. I stayed up late, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling, the city moving outside. I thought about all the ways families break, about the small surrenders that become large losses, about how easy it is to let someone else define what's necessary. I thought about Diane, probably running the same game somewhere else, looking for another family business, another vulnerable situation. I hoped her next target had someone like me, someone willing to be difficult, someone who knew how to follow money through the dark. But mostly I thought about Catherine, about the restaurant that bore her name again, about the recipes that would outlive both of us. I thought about the choice I'd made, to protect rather than keep peace, to act rather than hope things would improve. It wasn't a dramatic choice. It was a series of small decisions, each one made in the moment when silence would have been easier. Stay up late and check the books. Ask uncomfortable questions. Trust evidence over explanations. Refuse to sign papers. Say no when everyone expects yes. Those small decisions added up to something larger, something that looked like courage but felt more like responsibility. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because someone had to, and I was the only one who could. The restaurant opens every day at noon. Catherine's name is on the wall, painted fresh, exactly the way it should be. People come for lunch and dinner, ordering dishes she created, tasting recipes that traveled from Naples to Brooklyn across 3 generations. They don't know the story behind what they're eating. They don't need to. But I know. Rebecca knows. Catherine, in her moments of clarity, knows. We protected something that mattered, not perfectly, not without cost, but enough. We drew a line and said this far, no further. We chose dignity over convenience, truth over easy peace. And in the end, that's the only story that matters. Not the confrontation, not the legal battle, not the moment Diane walked out. The story that matters is the one where a restaurant survives, where a name stays on a wall, where a woman can still stand at her stove on good days and remember who she is. That's what protection looks like. Not dramatic, just persistent. Not perfect, just present. Not a single heroic moment, but 1,000 small refusals to let go of what matters. Catherine's restaurant is still here. That's my victory. Not justice, not revenge, just continuity. Just a place where things are made the right way, every single time, exactly as they should be. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. If it made you think about what's worth protecting in your own life, about the cost of silence and the value of difficult choices, then subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps stories like this one being told. Thank you for listening.